I found the warning pressed between two recipe cards at the bottom of my grandmother's old tin box, scrawled in her shaky handwriting on the back of a stained index card for peach cobbler. It read, "Do not trust your brother. Save yourself." I didn't understand it then. 5 years later, I bought his flagship restaurant at a foreclosure auction, renamed it the True Matriarch, and now every table receives a laminated card with the history of a dish, a photograph of our grandmother, and the federal court docket number of his conviction. That is where this story ends, but it starts at a funeral. My name is Claire, and I'm a former library cataloger from Lexington, Kentucky. For 23 years, I managed the special collections database at the university, assigning Dewey Decimals to crumbling church cookbooks and Senate subcommittee transcripts alike. I spent 2 decades turning my grandmother's handwritten recipes into a proper cookbook because I understood one thing better than anyone: metadata, provenance, the chain of custody that proves a thing is what it says it is. My brother Mason, on the other hand, understood cameras. He had a regional cooking show on public access that he called Mason's Seasonings, a mountain of credit card debt, and a wife named Elise, whose entire personality was built on Instagram filters and white marble countertops she could not afford. Our grandmother, Eddie, raised me after our parents died when I was 9 and Mason was 12. He bounced between boarding schools on scholarships while I stayed in the old house on Ash Street and learned to roll pie dough with cold fingertips, to test jam on a chilled plate, and to never measure vanilla extract with a heavy hand. She was 79 when she passed peacefully in her sleep, and I was the one who found her in the morning, the Afghan still tucked under her chin. The funeral was closed casket, an unseasonably warm Tuesday in April at the Baptist Church on Clays Mill Road. By the time the first scoop of dirt hit the coffin lid, Mason and Elise were already circling the house like real estate vultures. Within 48 hours, Elise had hired a junk removal truck from a company that advertised estate clear-outs, no sentimentality, cash preferred. She walked through Graham's kitchen wearing tight beige trousers and latex gloves, holding her phone to her ear with her shoulder, directing 2 men in coveralls to toss copper jelly pans and stoneware mixing bowls into contractor bags. Mason stood on the front lawn in a navy blazer that was one size too tight, talking to a producer on speakerphone about a bereavement episode to boost his ratings, while I sat on the edge of my childhood bed in the back bedroom, folding the Afghans Graham had crocheted during the winters she could no longer garden. I could hear drawers being yanked open, a cast-iron skillet hitting the hardwood floor with a resonant gong, Elise's laugh when she said, "All this tarnished crap, who keeps a dented tin of old index cards?" Then I heard the light, hollow thump of a small metal box hitting the inside of a trash bin. I waited until they went out to schmooze the funeral director for a discounted urn, then I fished the box out of the bag. It was an old Prince Albert tobacco tin, rusted at the seams, the red and yellow label half flaked away. Graham used it for her most guarded recipes because she refused to write them in a book that anyone could steal. Inside were maybe 30 cards, each yellowed and warped from decades of steam above the stove, some written in pencil, others in fountain pen with loops so tight they looked like thread. I carried it to my car, a 10-year-old Honda with a library parking sticker still on the bumper, and tucked it under the passenger seat before anyone noticed. That night, in the cheap motel off New Circle Road where I'd booked a room because I refused to sleep in Graham's house while they were still there, I sat cross-legged on the bedspread and started sorting the cards by category, the way I would in the library basement when a donation box came in. Cakes, breads, preserves, meats, vegetables, sauces. When I got to the back of the stack, I found a card that didn't list ingredients. It was thicker than the others, a 5x7 index card with a blue ruled line down the left side. On the back, in Graham's narrow cursive that I knew as well as my own heartbeat, were the words, "Do not trust your brother, save yourself." Below it, a date from 3 years earlier and a smaller note. Mason came by again asking about the recipes. I told him they were lost. He didn't believe me. I've taken steps. I stared at that card for a long time, turning it over to the blank front as if an ingredient list might appear. Then I tucked it into the inner pocket of my purse and sat in the dark, the hum of the ice machine down the hall the only sound. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that a family recipe is a sacred inheritance, not a commodity to be stolen. I want to tell you exactly how the trap closed, and how a quiet woman with a library card and a set of lockpicks dismantled a TV chef's entire fraudulent empire. The next morning, I drove to Graham's lawyer's office in a strip mall off Harrodsburg Road to probate the will. Mason was already there in a charcoal blazer, holding a latte in a cup with a little green mermaid on it, his hair freshly cut for the cameras that would inevitably follow. Elise sat next to him, pearl earrings gleaming, a clipboard resting on her knee with a printed document already clipped to it. The lawyer, a soft-spoken man named Mr. Ellison who had handled Graham's simple estate planning for 30 years, explained that the house and its contents were to be split equally between us. Before he could get to the bank accounts or the safe deposit box, Mason leaned across the arm of his chair and put his hand over mine. "Claire's in no state to handle a property sale," he said, his voice dripping with performative concern. "She's always been the sensitive one, you know. We think it's best if she signs over the estate to us temporarily, just to let the dust settle. I'll take care of everything, and she can focus on her health." Elise slid a document across the conference table. It was a limited power of attorney, notarized and ready, naming Mason as my agent for all matters concerning the estate. The body of the text was dense with legalese, but my eye caught a subclause about the transfer of all intellectual property rights, including copyright, trademark, and moral rights in any collected works, published or unpublished. The hair on my arm stood up. He wanted the recipes, and he wanted them before anyone noticed his paperwork was already filed. I played weak. I let my hand tremble as I held the pen they offered. I said I was foggy from grief, that I hadn't slept in days, that I couldn't make sense of all the words. I asked if I could take the document home and review it with a clearer head, maybe have a friend look at it. Elise's smile tightened until her lipstick cracked. Mason patted my hand again and said, "Of course, sis, take all the time you need, but don't wait too long. The vultures are circling, if you know what I mean." I folded the document in thirds, creasing it with my thumbnail the way Graham taught me to fold a letter, and put it in my bag. That evening, Mason insisted I stay at their house in Louisville. "You shouldn't be alone," he said. "We have a guest suite. It has its own entrance and a little kitchenette. You need to be cared for." I knew exactly what it was, a control tactic. Under their roof, they could monitor my phone calls, isolate me from Graham's neighbors and other relatives, and keep the pressure steady until I broke and signed. But I accepted, because I needed to be inside that house, and I needed them to believe I was harmless. The guest suite was a converted garage with a separate door leading to the driveway, a small bathroom with a fiberglass shower stall, and a kitchenette with a mini-fridge that hummed louder than the ceiling fan. The walls were painted a shade of grage that felt like a corporate lobby, and the art was a framed print of a wine glass on a blurred background, the kind of thing you buy in a set of 3 at a home goods store. They gave me a key and a Wi-Fi password and told me to rest. I spent the first 3 days shuffling around in worn slippers, keeping my voice soft and my shoulders slumped, responding to their probing questions about Graham's house and the recipe box with vague, sleepy answers. I wanted them to think I was a fogged-up relic who couldn't organize her own sock drawer. It was the most important performance of my life. At night, after they'd retreated to the main house, I began to watch. The walls were thin in that converted garage, and I learned to identify the muffled rhythm of Mason's phone calls. He'd pace from the kitchen to the pantry, his voice clipped and hissing through the drywall like a slow leak in a gas line. I'd press my ear to the wall near the water heater and catch fragments. "I said next quarter, not this quarter. And if they pull the credit line before the book launch, we're dead. Elise, completely dead." Elise would dodge calls and then scroll real estate listings on her tablet, posting photos of a kitchen remodel that had never actually been completed, while a stack of overdue utility notices sat on the hall table in a wicker basket. Their whole lifestyle was a soufflé of borrowed money, and the center was already collapsing. My real break came because of a plumbing disaster on the 5th afternoon. Elise had been trying to make a smoothie in the main kitchen, and she forced a frozen banana peel down the drain until the garbage disposal seized. She shrieked like a tea kettle, and Mason came running, jabbing the red reset button under the sink with the handle of a wooden spoon while water backed up into the basin and spilled over the granite edge onto the travertine floor. They stood there arguing, wet shoes on wet tiles, about whether to call an emergency plumber for $200 an hour or just order takeout and ignore it. I walked in from the guest suite wearing a pair of Graham's old gardening clogs, asked for a flashlight and a set of Allen keys, and lay on my back on the damp floorboards with a towel bunched under my head. I reached up into the dark cavity of the sink cabinet, found the breaker box on the wall first, and cut the power to the disposal so I wouldn't lose a finger. Then I located the hex socket at the base of the unit, inserted the right size Allen key, and worked the flywheel back and forth manually until the jammed banana fibers released. That fixed the disposal, but the water still leaked when I ran the tap, so I traced the drip to a loose compression nut on the brass P-trap. The rubber washer inside was cracked in half from age. I asked Mason for a hacksaw, and when he just stared at me, I walked out to the garage, found a rusty hacksaw hanging on a pegboard, and cut a clean section of the corroded pipe. I had stopped at a hardware store that morning because I'd noticed the damp cabinet floor the day before and anticipated this exact moment. I'd bought a new 1.5-inch compression coupling for $7, and I sweated it onto the pipe with a little jar of flux and a propane torch that I'd borrowed from Graham's tool shed years ago and kept in my trunk because she'd taught me that a woman who can't fix a leak pays twice. Mason stood in the doorway, dripping latte on the floor, and watched me tighten the nut with a pair of slip-joint pliers until the drop of water stopped. "Since when do you know how to do this?" he asked, his face twitching between confusion and irritation. "Grandma's house had a lot of broken things," I said quietly, wiping my hands on a rag. I paid attention. That was the first crack in their condescension. Over the following week, I played the same card with a furnace filter so clogged the house smelled like burnt toast, with a tripped GFCI outlet in the bathroom that Elise had been running a hair dryer and a curling iron on, and with a stuck window sash in the guest suite that I freed by rubbing a bar of soap along the track. I was the quiet, competent one they'd always dismissed as a dusty library mouse, and it unnerved them. But more importantly, it gave me a reason to move through the house at odd hours, to be in the basement looking for a pipe wrench, to be in the garage sorting through a box of old extension cords, to be in the hallway near Mason's home office carrying a plunger. Nobody questions a woman with a tool belt and a determined expression, not even a manipulative TV chef. Mason's home office was a converted den off the main hallway, with a heavy oak door and a brass knob that stuck. The room smelled of stale coffee and the faint chemical tang of printer toner. He had a cheap 5-drawer file cabinet in the corner, the kind with a wafer lock that any teenager can defeat with a paperclip. I knew, because Graham had an old china cabinet in the living room with the same lock, and she taught me how to pick it when I was 13, so I could retrieve a stuck drawer full of her mother's hand-embroidered napkins. She'd bent a bobby pin into a hooked rake and cut a tension wrench from the metal insert inside an old windshield wiper blade. I still carried that tension wrench in my wallet, tucked behind my library card, because some skills you don't let rust. One Thursday afternoon, Mason and Elise left for a lunch meeting with a potential sauce distribution sponsor, and I heard the garage door grind shut with a thud that shook the wall. I gave them 10 minutes, then I walked into the main house barefoot so my footsteps wouldn't echo, carrying a roll of paper towels and a spray bottle of vinegar as camouflage. The office door wasn't locked, which told me Mason relied entirely on that filing cabinet for his secrets. I knelt in front of the bottom drawer, slipped the tension wrench into the keyway, and applied a gentle clockwise torque until I felt the plug bind. Then I slid the rake in and out with a steady jitter, listening for the soft click of each wafer setting above the shear line. 3 minutes of focused breathing later, the plug turned, and the drawer slid open with a pneumatic sigh. Inside, behind a hanging folder of tax returns, I found a thick manila envelope labeled Eddie's Kitchen, IP. My hands were steady, but my heart was beating in my throat like a drum line. I pulled the envelope out, sat cross-legged on the floor, and began to read. The first document was a certificate of registration from the U.S. Copyright Office, dated 2 months before Graham died, for compilation titled Eddie's Kitchen, Secret Family Recipes. The claimant listed was Mason Mayfield, as sole author. Below that, a publishing contract from a well-known New York imprint, detailing a $380,000 advance against royalties, paid in 3 installments, with a schedule for a branded line of jarred pasta sauces and a restaurant franchise concept. There were emails printed between Mason and a ghostwriter, a woman named Candace, where he instructed her to standardize the instructions, cut all the folksy language about pinches and dashes, and replace the origin stories with mentions of my own culinary lineage and my show. A later email from Candace read, "Are these recipes truly yours? I ask because the advance reviewers might check." Mason's reply was one line, "They're family recipes, that's all that matters. Bill it as heritage." My jaw clenched so hard my back teeth ached. Then I found the smoking gun, a photocopy of a handwritten assignment of copyright, signed in blue ink, purportedly by Eddie Mayfield, transferring all rights in the recipes I have developed and collected over my lifetime to Mason for $1 and other good and valuable consideration. I held it up to the light from the window. The signature was wrong. Graham's signature had a narrow loop on the D that curled upward and a crossbar on the T that angled sharply left. This one had a round, hesitant D, and a crossbar that floated too high, like someone had tried to copy it from a reference without understanding the rhythm of her hand. The ink was uniform and dark, no variation in pressure, the kind of line you get from a mouse on a graphics tablet or a scanned image. I looked closer and saw a faint pixelation along the edge of the M in Merrifield. It had been digitally composited. I know that handwriting as well as my own pulse. I'd spent 2 decades cataloging every flourish on her recipe cards, every grocery list she'd taped to the fridge, every birthday card with her shaky late-life script. That signature was a forgery, and a lazy one. I photographed every page with my phone, making sure the date stamps and the email headers were legible. Then I replaced the envelope exactly as I'd found it, closed the drawer, and relocked it. I walked back to the guest suite with a forced calm, sat on the edge of the bed, and let my legs shake for 3 full minutes. Then I cried, not from sadness but from a cold, clarifying rage that spread through my chest like ice forming over a pond. The man had stolen our grandmother's life's work before she was even in the ground, and now he was running a scheme to position me as the unstable, grieving sister who needed to be managed so no one would question the copyright. Over the next 2 weeks, I continued my act of docile compliance while building a case methodically, like a cataloger cross-referencing a fraudulent accession record. I called Graham's old neighbor, Ruth, a retired nurse who lived 3 houses down and still walked her labradoodle past the boxwoods every morning. I used a burner phone I'd bought at a drugstore, just in case Mason was monitoring my call log. Ruth told me that about 3 years ago, she'd seen Mason pull up in a rented BMW, dressed in a suit, with a woman carrying a notary stamp. He'd knocked on Graham's door for a full 10 minutes, and when Graham finally opened it, she stood in the doorframe with her arms crossed. Ruth had peeked through her front blinds and heard Graham's voice, clear and sharp. "I told you those are not for sale. Get off my porch." Mason had tried to wedge a foot in the door, and Graham had slammed it so hard the brass knocker rattled. The notary lady had shrugged and gotten back in the car. Ruth said she'd never seen a man so angry over a box of cards. I visited the bank where Graham kept a safe deposit box on Richmond Road. I was listed as executor on the will, so the bank manager, a woman with a careful bun and a kind smile, led me into the vault. The box was a long steel drawer, number 117, cool to the touch. When I lifted the lid, the first thing I saw was a sealed white envelope with my name on the front, written in Graham's hand. Inside was a letter, dated the same month as the warning card I'd found in the tobacco tin, and a copy of a U.S. Copyright Office registration certificate from 2010 for a collection titled The Eddie Mayfield Home Cookbook, listing Eddie Mayfield as author and including a detailed inventory of 127 recipes with their original titles, dates, and first lines of the method text. The registration number was TXU1-782-461. I stared at it for a full 30 seconds, letting the significance settle like flour dusting a countertop. She had filed a copyright 18 years ago for her own handwritten recipes, and she had never mentioned it to anyone. Her letter was 3 pages long, written on the same lined paper she used for her prayer list. She wrote that she'd seen Mason's ambition curdle into something venal over the years, that he'd tried 3 times to pressure her into signing over rights to the recipes so he could launch a brand, and that she'd consulted a lawyer after his last visit. The lawyer, a woman she called MS Park, had set up an irrevocable trust, placing all commercial rights to the recipes into the trust with me as the sole beneficiary and trustee upon Graham's death. The trust document was enclosed, signed and notarized, with a letter of direction to the attorney. She ended the letter with a line that made me press my knuckles to my mouth. He thinks I'm a simple old woman with a flour sack mind. But I filed my paperwork before he ever filed his first bankruptcy. You'll know what to do. I had a dead man's switch. The trust didn't physically prevent Mason from stealing the recipes, but it meant that any revenue derived from them legally belonged to the trust and ultimately to me. His later registration with the Copyright Office was predated and superseded by Graham's. The publishing contract, the franchise agreements, the branding, all of it was built on a foundation of fraud, and the court could order disgorgement of profits, restitution, even criminal penalties if I could prove intent. I contacted the attorney who had drawn up the trust, Sylvia Park, whose name I found on the letterhead inside the safe deposit box envelope. I called her from the parking lot of the bank, my voice low but steady. Sylvia was calm, hyper-articulate, and immediately outraged on my behalf. She met me at a diner near the courthouse 2 days later, a tall woman in a navy pantsuit with a briefcase that had seen years of litigation. She laid out the landscape over coffee in a cracked mug. She had already pulled Graham's original copyright certificate from the Library of Congress database. "Your brother's registration is legally void," she said, tapping a printout. "But we need to prove he knew it was fraudulent at the time, because that elevates it from civil infringement to criminal wire fraud and false statements under the Copyright Act." She wanted the forged assignment, the emails, and any evidence of his financial motive, like the shell company I'd glimpsed in the emails. Sylvia also mentioned that a federal investigator from the U.S. Attorney's Office, a man named Ruiz, was building a case against a cluster of IP theft rings that had been targeting elderly artists and crafters. She thought my situation might fit his pattern, and she set up a meeting. I sat in a windowless room at the federal building downtown, across a metal table from Agent Ruiz, a quiet man in a gray jacket with a voice so calm it made you want to confess things. I explained everything, showed him the photographs on my phone, the forged signature, the copyright registration dates. He listened without interrupting, then asked me 2 questions. "Do you have access to his computer? And would you be willing to help us gather the final evidence from inside the home?" I nodded. He handed me a small black USB drive that looked like a car key fob, with a hidden boot partition that would image a hard drive without triggering antivirus software. He said that if I could plug it into Mason's desktop while he was out and leave it connected for 15 minutes, the tool would pull every deleted email, every Photoshop layer, every financial spreadsheet, and upload it to a secure federal server. I slipped the drive into the pocket of my cardigan and felt the weight of it like a key. I still had to survive inside Mason's house while Sylvia and Ruiz built the legal framework. I needed one final piece of evidence that would show not just calculated fraud, but a complete absence of human decency, the kind of detail that sways a jury when they're sitting in a cold courtroom and deciding whether to send a man to federal prison. So I set a trap. One evening at dinner, I told Elise that I'd been feeling lightheaded, that my vision had gotten spotty in the afternoons, and I let my fork clatter onto my plate for effect. Over the next few days, I performed a gradual decline, holding the banister when I walked upstairs, rubbing my temples, letting my voice go faint. On a Friday afternoon, I staged a collapse in the hallway just outside Mason's office door. I had practiced it in the bathroom mirror, a controlled slump against the wall where I let my knees buckle and slid down slowly, my shoulder hitting the baseboard with a soft thump that sounded serious but didn't leave a bruise. I lay on the carpet with my eyes half closed, my breathing shallow, and I positioned my arm so that a manila envelope I'd brought from my room was visible on the floor near my hand. Inside the envelope was a copy of the forged assignment page, the one with the pixelated signature, which I'd printed from my phone. I wanted to see what he'd do if he thought I'd found it. Mason was on a phone call in the office, his voice drifting through the closed door. I heard him say, "No, the quarterly numbers are projection, not actuals. You tell the bank that." Then I made the thump. He paused, said, "Hold on," and the door opened. I lay motionless, my cheek pressed to the carpet fibers, and I could see his polished brown loafers stop 6 inches from my head. He didn't bend down. He didn't say my name. He looked at my still body, then his gaze shifted to the envelope on the floor. I watched through the slit of my eyelashes as he reached down, picked up the envelope, and slid the pages halfway out. He saw the forged assignment, and his face didn't change, not one flicker of surprise or guilt. He just tucked the envelope under his arm, stepped over my legs with one clean stride, and walked toward the kitchen to finish his call. He left me lying there on the hallway floor for a full 90 seconds while he discussed cash flow projections with someone named Brett. I heard the ice maker dump and a glass clink. Then he walked back, nudged my shoulder with the toe of that polished loafer, and said, "Claire, you okay?" With the enthusiasm of a man checking a tire pressure gauge. I came to slowly, blinking, mumbling about not eating breakfast. He helped me sit up, said I should see a doctor, and handed the envelope back to me without a word about its contents. He did not ask what it was. He did not ask if I had read it. That told me everything. He had seen a woman possibly dying on the floor, and his first, second, and fifth concern was the exposure of his forgery. I knew then that any residual family loyalty I'd been nursing like a splinter was gone. He would let me die on that carpet if it saved his TV career and his restaurant franchise. That was the point of no return. That night, after Elise had given me a glass of orange juice and sent me to bed with a battery of performative concern, I recorded a detailed statement on a secure voice memo app that Sylvia had installed on a clean tablet. I described the envelope incident, the forgery, the trust, everything, in a slow, calm voice, the way I'd been trained to narrate accession records for archival collections. Then I emailed the file to Sylvia and Agent Ruiz. The next morning, while Mason was at the local PBS studio taping a segment on spring asparagus tips, and Elise was at a spin class on Shelbyville Road, I cooked breakfast in the main kitchen. I used Graham's cast-iron skillet, the 10-inch Wagner that she'd seasoned with bacon grease for 40 years, and I fried bacon and eggs over easy, the way she'd taught me when I was tall enough to see over the stove. I let the smell fill the house, because hot bacon is the best olfactory camouflage there is, and it masks any sound of movement. Then I walked into the office, closed the door, told the voice assistant on my phone to set a timer for 15 minutes with a loud chime at the end, and inserted Agent Ruiz's USB drive into the port on the back of Mason's desktop tower. The computer was still on, the screen showing a spreadsheet of projected restaurant revenues. The drive began its silent imaging. I stood frozen, watching the seconds tick on my phone, listening for the garage door opener. At one point, a text popped onto the screen from Elise. "Almost done, can you pick up dry cleaning?" My heart stopped and restarted. 10 minutes. 12. The tool finished with a soft green blink on the drive's hidden indicator. I pulled it, slipped it into the pocket of my apron, and walked back to the kitchen to flip the eggs. No one ever suspected a thing. The data recovered was devastating. It contained the original layered Photoshop file where Mason had scanned Graham's signature from a birthday card she'd sent him 5 years ago, cut it out using the magnetic lasso tool, and pasted it onto a blank assignment document he'd typed in Word. The metadata showed him editing the document at 2:14 a.m. on a Tuesday, reselecting the signature edge 3 times to remove a stray pixel. There were emails with his accountant, a man named Gerald in Nevada, discussing how to structure the $380,000 advance through a shell LLC called Bluegrass Heritage Holdings, so that the money would appear as a business loan and bypass any estate claim. In one email, Mason wrote, "If the old Batts estate comes after me, I just need a 6-month buffer to get the franchise off the ground. By then Claire will be too broke to sue." Those words, typed by his own fingers, on the record, Sylvia moved with the precision of a watchmaker. The U.S. attorney filed a criminal complaint under 18 U.S.C. Section 2319 for copyright infringement for profit, and under the wire fraud statute for the interstate electronic communications that included the publishing contract negotiations and the shell company bank transfers. A federal judge issued seizure warrants for all bank accounts connected to Mason's restaurant group and arrest warrants for Mason and his accountant. Sylvia coordinated with the marshals to execute the warrants at the grand opening of Mason's first franchise location, a brick storefront on East Market Street in Louisville that he had named Mason's Eddie's Kitchen, trying to brand himself as the heir. I insisted on being there. The day came in late October, a Saturday with a high blue sky and a line of local food bloggers wrapping around the block. The restaurant had a neon sign out front, shaped like a whisk, and Elise was at a table near the door, handing out samples of pimento cheese on toasted baguette slices, wearing a brand-new apron with the logo embroidered in gold. Mason stood behind the counter in a monogrammed chef's coat, his hair sprayed stiff, giving an interview to a local lifestyle magazine about the importance of honoring family traditions. I watched from across the street for a moment, my stomach tight as a drum. Then I straightened the lapels of the navy suit I'd bought specifically for this moment, nodded to Sylvia on my left and Agent Ruiz on my right, and walked through the door with 2 uniformed federal marshals behind me. The chatter in the restaurant didn't fall silent immediately. It took a few seconds for the customers to register the presence of men with badges and guns. I walked to the center of the room, where Mason was holding a plate of fried chicken sliders, and I raised my hand. "My name is Claire Mayfield," I said, loud enough for the blogger's iPhone to pick up. "I'm the woman who actually collected these recipes. Every dish you see today is stolen intellectual property, backed by a forged signature. The man you're about to celebrate filed a fraudulent copyright registration and defrauded a publisher out of nearly $400,000 using my grandmother's name. I have the federal warrants to prove it." Mason's face went through 3 expressions in half a second: confusion, rage, and then a slack emptiness I had never seen. Ruiz stepped forward and handed him a thick stack of papers. "Mason Mayfield, you are under arrest for criminal copyright infringement, wire fraud, and false statements under the Copyright Act." The marshals turned him around and cuffed him, the metal clicking into place just as Elise dropped the tray of pimento cheese samples onto the reclaimed wood floor. A blogger's phone camera caught the entire thing, and by the time the marshals led Mason out the side door, the video had already been posted to 3 platforms. It went viral by midnight, the screenshot of his face behind his shoulder next to the word fraud trending for most of the next day. Mason's world collapsed in layers, like a pastry that's been overworked. The publishing contract was nullified, and the advance was clawed back within a week. The restaurant group's investors filed a civil lawsuit for fraud and breach of contract, freezing the remaining funds. The bank seized the accounts under the federal warrant, leaving him unable to pay the lease on the East Market Street flagship or the salaries of the line cooks he had already been stiffing on overtime. 2 months later, the flagship restaurant filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy, and the court ordered the sale of all business assets, including the physical property, the equipment, the liquor license, and the trademark application Mason had filed for Eddie's Kitchen. That's when my trust stepped forward. As the legal owner of the copyright that had been valued as the core asset of the franchise, I was able to petition the bankruptcy court for a directed sale. Sylvia filed a motion explaining that the intellectual property Mason had built his business on was stolen from the trust, and that the trust had a right to reclaim the proceeds. The judge agreed and issued an order that gave me first position to bid. I didn't want Mason's debt. I wanted his building. Using the modest advance from a legitimate cookbook deal, I negotiated with a smaller, ethical publisher who had previously rejected Mason because they suspected his culinary lineage story was thin. I placed the winning bid at the foreclosure auction. I paid $312,000 for the keys, the equipment, the lease, the walk-in cooler, the 6-burner gas range, and the neon whisk sign, which I had disconnected and donated to a prop warehouse for a community theater. I renamed the restaurant The True Matriarch. I hired back every line cook, dishwasher, and server Mason had stiffed, some of whom had been waiting months for their final paychecks, and I paid them their back wages out of the first week's revenue plus a small loan from the trust. I personally trained them in Graham's methods, not with the speed and impatience of a TV chef, but with the slow, repetitive practice she'd used with me. The way to brine fried chicken in buttermilk with a pinch of cayenne until the meat pulled clean from the bone. The way to roll biscuit dough with a floured wine bottle, because Graham never owned a rolling pin. The way to test a chess pie filling with a jiggle at the center like a soft-set custard. Every dish on the menu is exactly as she wrote it, and if a cook substitutes margarine for butter, I make them scrub the flat top and start over. On every table, I place a small brass stand with a laminated card. One side shows a photograph of Graham in her kitchen on Ash Street, her apron dusted with flour, a wooden spoon in her hand, and that half-smile she'd give when she knew the biscuits were perfect. The other side has a 2-paragraph story of the dish on that table, a direct quote from her recipe card, and at the bottom, in clear type, U.S. District Court, Western District of Kentucky, Case No. 3, 22 CR 00084, U.S. v. Mason Mayfield, 17 U.S.C. Section 506, A, 18 U.S.C. Section 1343. That docket number means he pleaded guilty to 2 felony counts after his lawyer saw the Photoshop evidence and advised him to avoid a trial. He served 14 months in a federal correctional institution in Manchester, Kentucky, and was released on supervised probation. The court ordered restitution of $427,000, which covered my legal fees, the cookbook advance I had lost, the back wages for the staff, and a contribution to a culinary scholarship fund I established in Graham's name at the local community college. The checks arrive every month like a quiet metronome. The true matriarch is profitable now. Not extravagantly, not TV chef profitable, but enough that the lights stay on, the walk-in is full, and there's a line out the door on Sunday afternoons. I still cook 3 shifts a week, and sometimes customers recognize me from the video and ask to shake my hand. I always tell them the same thing: I'm not a chef. I'm a library cataloger who knew how to organize, how to observe, how to pick a cheap filing cabinet lock, and how to read the metadata on a copyright certificate, because her grandmother prepared her for things no cookbook ever covers. Graham was a quiet architect of justice. She knew her recipes were valuable, not just sentimentally but commercially, and she protected them with the same methodical care she used to scald a jar for peach preserves. Her copyright filing in 2010 was her dead man's switch, lying dormant in a steel drawer until I was ready to find it. The warning scratched on the back of her recipe card wasn't a curse. It was a map, and she trusted me to follow it. My brother, the TV chef, now works the breakfast shift at a chain diner outside Nashville, frying eggs on a flat-top griddle under fluorescent lights, because no reputable restaurant will hire a convicted IP felon. His wife left him 18 days after the arrest, took the white marble countertops with her in the divorce, and the Instagram account was deleted without a farewell post. I don't gloat about it, but I do keep one thing on the wall of my restaurant office above the desk where I balance the ledgers: the original peach cobbler recipe card, framed in simple oak, with the warning facing out. It reminds me that family can be the most dangerous ingredient of all, and that sometimes the sweetest dish is served with a side of legal precedent. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? I'd love to hear your story in the comments. And if you believe that a grandmother's handwritten recipe is a sacred trust that no television camera can replace, hit like and subscribe. There are more stories like this coming, and I'm the one who will make sure the record stays straight. Until next time, keep your skillet seasoned and your copyright current.